Malcolm St. James had it all: money, power, and a last name that commanded respect. But when his father forced him into an arranged marriage, his life took an unexpected turn. He expected a submissive wife, someone who would bend to his will. Instead, he got a mysterious veiled bride who refused to show her face. At first, he was furious, convinced she was hiding something: ugliness, shame, or worse. But as he got to know her, her sharp mind and fearless spirit began to consume his thoughts. Hatred turned to obsession. Obsession turned to something he never expected: love. But when the veil finally came off, Malcolm would face a truth more shocking than he ever imagined. Was it too late to right his wrongs, or would his arrogance cost him everything? Before we start, buckle up, get ready, and subscribe for a special surprise tomorrow. Malcolm St. James never had to beg for anything in his life. Born into wealth, raised in luxury, and groomed to inherit his father's empire, he was accustomed to control. The world bowed before him, except apparently his own father. "You will marry her, Malcolm. It's not up for discussion." The words rang in his head like a hammer striking steel. Sitting in the grand study of the St. James estate, he stared at the man who had built their fortune with ruthless ambition. His father's face, carved from stone and just as unforgiving, made it clear this was not a request. Malcolm clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to stand and leave. "Marriage? To a woman I've never even met? You can't be serious." His father leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany desk. "Do you think love built this family, Malcolm? Do you think emotion kept us at the top while others fell?" He scoffed. "This is about power. Their family has influence in circles we need access to. This union will secure our legacy for another generation." Malcolm had seen this tactic before, his father wielding power like a weapon, manipulating the board to his advantage. It was all a game to him, but this time Malcolm was the pawn. "You expect me to sign my life away for a business deal?" he snapped. His father's eyes darkened. "I expect you to uphold your duty." Malcolm let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. "And if I refuse?" His father exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. "Then you walk away from your inheritance, every penny, every company, everything I've built for you. You will leave this house with nothing." The weight of the words settled over him like a suffocating blanket. It was a threat, one his father would not hesitate to enforce. Malcolm wasn't naive. He had seen what happened to those who defied him. His uncle, his cousin, all cast aside, stripped of their privileges, left to fend for themselves. His entire life, Malcolm had been raised to believe he was entitled to the world. But without his father's backing, he would be nothing more than another man with a last name and no power. He gritted his teeth, hatred bubbling in his chest. "Fine, I'll marry her." His father's expression didn't change, as if he had expected nothing less. He slid a folder across the desk. "The wedding is in 2 weeks." Malcolm snatched it up, scanning the contents. A single photograph sat atop the documents, a woman, her face veiled, revealing nothing but her eyes. A wave of unease crawled down his spine. "What is this?" "The woman you'll be spending the rest of your life with." Something about the picture unsettled him. No name, no details, just a bride wrapped in secrecy. His grip tightened around the folder. This was a mistake, but it was too late to turn back now. The wedding day arrived faster than Malcolm had anticipated, and with it came a suffocating sense of inevitability. The Grand St. James estate had been transformed into a spectacle of wealth. Golden chandeliers, silk-draped tables, an orchestra playing in the background. The guest list was a who's who of power: industry moguls, politicians, and old-money elites sipping champagne, murmuring about the mysterious union. Malcolm stood at the altar, jaw clenched, barely listening to the murmuring priest. He had resigned himself to this arrangement, but irritation burned in his chest. He was Malcolm St. James, the heir to an empire, and here he was, waiting for a woman he had never met, bound to a deal he never agreed to. Then the doors opened. The room fell silent. Zara entered, her wedding gown flowing like liquid silver, embroidered with delicate gold threading. But it wasn't the gown that drew every gaze. It was the veil. Unlike traditional brides who wore sheer lace or tulle, hers was thick, opaque, covering her face completely. Not a single feature could be seen beneath the elegant fabric. Only the soft outline of her lips and the dark glint of her eyes hinted at the woman beneath. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Malcolm's jaw tightened. She kept her head high as she walked down the aisle, her posture composed, graceful. Not once did she hesitate, falter, or show any sign of discomfort. If anything, she was the calmest person in the room. Malcolm's fingers curled into fists at his sides. What the hell was this? She stopped before him, standing impossibly still. The priest continued, speaking of love, unity, and devotion, but Malcolm barely heard a word. His mind was fixated on the absurdity of the situation. When prompted, he said the vows through gritted teeth. Zara's voice was softer, smoother, yet steady, as she spoke her part without hesitation. Then came the moment he had been waiting for, the kiss. Malcolm exhaled sharply, turning to face her. She lifted her chin slightly as if challenging him. "Remove the veil," he muttered under his breath. The room was deathly silent. Zara did not move. His scowl deepened. Now, still she remained composed. Then, in a voice only he could hear, she said, "A kiss is not needed to seal a contract." A flicker of anger flashed through him, but before he could respond, the priest continued, announcing them husband and wife. Applause erupted around them, but Malcolm heard nothing. Beyond the pounding in his ears, she turned toward the crowd unshaken. Malcolm stood rigid beside her, his fury barely contained. This was not a marriage. This was a spectacle, and now he was bound to a woman who refused to even show him her face. The ride back to the St. James estate was silent. Malcolm sat rigid. In the back seat of the sleek black limousine, his hands clenched into fists against his thighs. Beside him, Zara sat with the same impossible composure she had maintained throughout the entire farce of a wedding. Her veil remained intact, an unspoken barrier between them. Every muscle in his body was wound tight. He had endured the whispers, the knowing glances from the guests, the murmurs of confusion and scandal. The heir to the St. James fortune had married a ghost, a woman no one had truly seen. He needed answers. The moment they arrived at the estate, Malcolm strode inside without waiting for her. He went straight to his study, poured himself a drink, and barely had time to take a sip before he heard the soft click of the door closing behind him. Zara stood there, her presence impossibly calm despite the storm raging inside him. He set his glass down with deliberate care before turning to face her. "Take it off." She didn't react. "Excuse me?" His jaw tightened. "The veil." She tilted her head slightly. "Why?" His patience snapped. "Because I am your husband, and I refuse to spend another second in this absurd situation, pretending that this," he gestured between them, voice dripping with disdain, "is anything close to a real marriage." Zara was quiet for a long moment, then stepped forward, each movement precise and unhurried. "What do you think will change if you see my face?" The question threw him off balance. He had expected defiance, maybe even an excuse, but not that. He scoffed, shaking his head. "I'll finally know what I married." Zara let out a quiet as if considering his words. "And if I were ugly," his lips curled, "then at least I'd know what I was dealing with." For the first time, something flickered beneath her veil. Amusement? Pity? He couldn't tell. "I see," she murmured. "So you believe truth is tied to appearance?" Malcolm took a sharp step forward, his frustration boiling over. "This isn't philosophy, this is reality, and in reality, people show their faces." Zara didn't flinch. If anything, she seemed unimpressed by his anger, which only irritated him further. "You're free to think that," she said simply, "but I won't take it off." He let out a sharp laugh, though there was no humor in it. "And why is that?" Her voice was soft yet firm. "Because you are not ready to see me." Something about the way she said it sent a chill down his spine. Not because he feared what lay beneath the veil, but because, for the first time in his life, he didn't have control. Without another word, Zara turned and left the study. Malcolm stared after her, grip tightening around his glass. This marriage was going to be war. Malcolm had never known frustration like this. Every morning he woke up to a wife he barely knew, a woman who moved through his estate with effortless grace yet remained an enigma behind that damned veil. She was polite, composed, and maddeningly indifferent to his presence. It was as if she had accepted this marriage for what it was, a transaction, and expected nothing from him beyond what was required. That should have been a relief. But instead, it infuriated him. He had expected resistance. He had expected awkward silences, forced intimacy, maybe even arguments. What he hadn't expected was Zara's complete and utter self-possession, her ability to stand in a room with him and act as though she wasn't locked in a battle of wills with a man determined to break through her walls. It was during breakfast, a week into their marriage, when the tension finally boiled over. Malcolm sat at the head of the long dining table, flipping through emails on his tablet while a steaming cup of coffee sat untouched beside him. Across from him, Zara sat unbothered, her hands resting neatly on the porcelain teacup she sipped from. He hadn't spoken to her in 2 days, not because he didn't have words, but because he refused to waste them on someone who refused to meet him halfway. But today, as she sat there, calm as ever, he couldn't take it anymore. "You enjoy this, don't you?" he said, setting his tablet down. Zara didn't look up. "Enjoy what?" "This game," he said coolly. "This silent war you've started. You think ignoring me makes you superior? She set her teacup down, tilting her head slightly. I didn't realize I was ignoring you. We're having breakfast together, aren't we? Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his gaze sharp. A real wife doesn't keep secrets from her husband, Zara hummed thoughtfully. And a real husband doesn't see his wife as something to be unveiled rather than understood. His patience cracked. I don't need to understand you, he said flatly. I just need you to take the damn thing off. A pause. Then Zara leaned forward slightly, resting her chin against her palm. Why does it bother you so much? Malcolm clenched his jaw. Because it's absurd. Because I, unlike you, am not pretending that this is normal. Zara exhaled, almost like she was disappointed. And what if this is my normal? He scoffed. Hiding behind fabric? She studied him for a moment, then smiled. Soft, knowing, and infuriating. You say that as if you aren't hiding behind something too. Malcolm stiffened. The words dug under his skin in a way he hadn't expected. She didn't give him a chance to respond. She rose from her chair, gracefully adjusting the edge of her sleeve. Thank you for breakfast, she said simply, then turned and left the room. Malcolm sat there seething. He had lost this round, and he hated it. Malcolm had never been consumed by curiosity before. He had always been a man of certainty, someone who saw the world in clear terms. What was his, what was not, what was worth his time, and what wasn't. But Zara was an anomaly, a woman who defied every expectation, who refused to bend to his demands, who hid yet stood taller than him at the same time. And now, she was inside his head. He tried to ignore it. He buried himself in work, spent long hours in his office, surrounded himself with business partners and old friends. He told himself he didn't care, that it didn't matter, that she was nothing more than a contract he had been forced to sign. But at night, when the house fell silent and he sat alone in his study, his mind betrayed him. What was she hiding? It wasn't just about the veil anymore. It was about the way she never flinched under his scrutiny, the way she never tried to impress him, the way she never demanded anything from him, not even acknowledgement, and that infuriated him most of all. He caught glimpses of her throughout the day, reading in the library, walking through the gardens, speaking softly to the staff who, to his annoyance, seemed to adore her. One afternoon, he walked into the study only to find her standing by the bookshelves, running her fingers across the spines. She didn't startle when he entered. She didn't even turn. You read? He asked, more out of irritation than genuine curiosity. She pulled a book from the shelf and finally glanced at him. Of course, he scoffed. What kind of books? Her fingers traced the edge of the novel in her hands. Philosophy? History? Politics? He smirked. Not romance? She tilted her head slightly. I prefer stories that make me think, not ones that lie to me about love. Malcolm leaned against the desk, arms crossed. And what do you think about love? Zara stared at him for a long moment before answering. That people are often more in love with the idea of someone than the person themselves. There was something unsettling about the way she said it, as if she were speaking to him directly, peeling him open layer by layer. He pushed off the desk, stepping closer. You think that's why I want to see your face? Because I have an idea of you in my head. Her gaze didn't waver. Don't you? His jaw tightened. Damn her. He could feel it now. The shift between them. The tension stretching. The battle lines being redrawn. This wasn't just about a veil anymore. This was about control. And for the first time in his life, Malcolm wasn't sure if he had any left. Malcolm hadn't meant to listen. He wasn't the kind of man who eavesdropped or lurked in hallways like some jealous, restless fool. And yet there he stood, hidden just beyond the slightly open door of the library, his hand frozen on the doorknob, listening to the sound of Zara's voice. She wasn't alone. She was speaking to one of the house staff, Margaret, an older woman who had served the St. James family for years. Normally, Malcolm wouldn't have cared about whatever conversation they were having, but something about Zara's tone was different, softer, unguarded, real. You've settled in well, dear, Margaret said warmly. I think so, Zara replied, though there was something thoughtful in her voice. Though it's different, being here, Margaret chuckled. I imagine it would be. You come from a very private family. This life, it's in the spotlight. Zara was silent for a moment before she said, People look at me, but they don't see me. Malcolm stiffened. Margaret hummed knowingly. And does that bother you? Zara let out a quiet laugh, small, almost sad. It's what I'm used to. Malcolm didn't move, barely breathed. For the first time since meeting her, Zara sounded human. There was no defiance, no amusement, no carefully constructed walls between them, just honesty, and for some reason, that made his chest tighten in a way he didn't like. He stepped into the room before he could stop himself. Margaret glanced up, surprised, but Zara didn't react at all. She knew he had been there. She was always one step ahead of him. Margaret excused herself quickly, disappearing down the hall, leaving them alone. Zara didn't look up from the book in her lap. Eavesdropping now? Malcolm ignored the accusation and walked to the bar cart in the corner, pouring himself a drink. You think people don't see you? Zara closed the book, finally meeting his gaze. Do they? He exhaled sharply through his nose, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. I see you. She tilted her head slightly. Do you? Malcolm set the glass down harder than necessary. I see you walking through my house like you belong here. I see you speaking in riddles, challenging me at every turn. I see you hiding behind that damn veil playing whatever game you think this is. Zara remained silent, watching him carefully. Then she asked, if I take it off, will that change everything? The question threw him. Would it? Would finally seeing her satisfy this obsession growing inside him? His throat tightened, his pride unwilling to let him hesitate. Yes, Zara sighed, standing slowly. Then I feel sorry for you. And just like that, she walked past him, leaving him standing there, drink in hand, feeling like he had just lost something he didn't even understand yet. Malcolm didn't lose arguments. He won them, crushed them beneath his heel, and walked away without a second thought. That was how he had been raised, how he had built his reputation. Power was about control, and control meant never letting anyone get the upper hand. And yet, Zara kept winning. He could feel it slipping, his patience, his certainty, his ability to dictate the terms of this marriage. She moved through his home as if she had always belonged there, as if his cold glares and clipped words meant nothing. She wasn't trying to defy him. That was what infuriated him most. She was simply being herself, and that was enough to drive him mad. His frustration reached its breaking point when his father summoned him to the office downtown. The moment Malcolm stepped into the towering St. James headquarters, he felt the weight of his father's disapproval settle over him. The older man sat behind his massive desk, eyes cold and assessing. You've made a spectacle of yourself, his father said, without preamble. Malcolm didn't bother pretending he didn't know what he meant. The wedding had been a public curiosity, whispers spreading like wildfire about the bride who never showed her face. I married her, Malcolm said evenly. I fulfilled my part of the deal. His father's lip curled. You married a question mark. He leaned forward, voice dropping. Do you think I don't hear the conversations? Do you think our business partners aren't second-guessing us now? You were supposed to solidify this family's power. Instead, you've turned us into gossip. Malcolm clenched his jaw. I'll handle it. You'll fix it. His father's voice was sharp, unwavering. Annul the marriage. Cut your losses before this becomes a scandal we can't recover from. Malcolm's hands curled into fists at his sides. Annul the marriage. Just like that. As if Zara was some mistake to erase. A month ago, he wouldn't have hesitated. But now, he could still hear her voice from the night before. If I take it off, will that change everything? He should have said yes without thinking. He should have torn the damn thing off himself. But he hadn't. Something had shifted, and he didn't know how to fix it. No, his father's expression darkened. What did you just say? Malcolm met his gaze without flinching. I said no. For the first time in his life, his father looked genuinely taken aback. You're telling me you refuse? Malcolm exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. I married her. I don't back out of my commitments. His father studied him for a long moment, then scoffed. Don't be a fool, Malcolm. This isn't about commitment, it's about control. And right now you have none. Malcolm's jaw tightened. He didn't respond, because for the first time he wasn't sure if his father was wrong. Malcolm arrived home with his father's words still burning in his mind. You have no control. It wasn't just a warning, it was a challenge. A reminder that for the first time in his life, someone was slipping through his fingers, and he hated it. He found Zara in the conservatory, where the evening light streamed through the glass, casting golden patterns on the marble floor. She was standing by the orchids, fingertips tracing the petals absently, lost in thought. You spoke to my father, he said without preamble. Zara didn't turn. And? He exhaled sharply, stepping forward. He wants me to annul the marriage. Her fingers stilled. Then she finally looked at him, the veil obscuring everything. But her eyes, calm, unreadable, infuriating. And what do you want? She asked. Malcolm scoffed. That's the thing, isn't it? This has never been about what I want. Her head tilted slightly. No? His patience snapped. I want to see your face. Silence stretched between them, heavy and electric. Zara let out a slow breath. And if you do? He stepped closer, heat rising in his chest. Then I'll finally know the truth. She studied him for a long moment. No, Malcolm, she said quietly. You'll only know what you want to see. That was it. The final thread of restraint broke. Before she could move, he reached forward, fingers grasping the edge of the veil. His pulse pounded in his ears, his breath shallow. She didn't flinch, didn't step away, just stood there, watching him, daring him. His hands shook. Why were they shaking? He could tear it off, right now. End this game. this power struggle, this obsession that was eating away at him like a disease. But he didn't. His fingers loosened, his breath uneven. Zara remained perfectly still, eyes locked onto his. "You're not ready," she murmured. Malcolm clenched his jaw, his heart hammering. He had never been more furious in his life. At her, at himself, at whatever this was between them that he couldn't control. "I should walk away from this," he muttered. Stepping back, Zara's voice was soft, but unshaken. "Then why don't you?" He didn't have an answer. Instead, he turned and stormed out of the conservatory, feeling more lost than he ever had before. Malcolm couldn't sleep. He lay awake in the vast emptiness of his bedroom, staring at the ceiling, his mind a chaotic storm of thoughts he didn't want to acknowledge. The weight of Zara's voice still lingered, that quiet certainty in her words. "You're not ready." It infuriated him because she was right. He had every opportunity to rip that veil away, to end this strange tension between them, to finally know. And yet, when the moment came, he had hesitated. His hands had shaken, not out of fear, not out of doubt, but because some part of him knew that seeing her wouldn't give him the control he so desperately wanted. It would only prove that he had already lost it. The clock struck 3. Malcolm exhaled, pushing himself up from the bed. He couldn't stay in this room any longer, suffocating in his own thoughts. He needed a drink. Slipping out of his room, he moved through the dimly lit corridors of the estate, his steps soundless against the hardwood floors. The house was silent, the staff long asleep, but when he reached the main hall he stopped. Light spilled from the sitting room, a faint golden glow stretching across the marble. Someone was awake. His pulse quickened. Moving quietly, he approached the doorway, his body tense with an anticipation he didn't understand. And then, Zara. She sat curled in an armchair, her legs tucked beneath her, a book resting in her lap. A single lamp illuminated her figure, casting soft shadows across the room. But what struck him wasn't the book or the way she sat. It was the fact that her veil was gone. She wasn't facing him. Her head was tilted down, lost in whatever she was reading, but her hair was visible, dark, and flowing over her shoulders, like silk. Her profile was partially obscured, but he caught glimpses of delicate features, the curve of her cheek, the slope of her nose, the barest hint of full lips. Something in his chest tightened. He should leave. He knew he should. This was the moment he had been waiting for, wasn't it? To see her without her knowing, to take back the power. And yet, he felt no victory, just something fragile, something he wasn't ready to name. Before he could make a decision, Zara turned her head slightly as if sensing his presence. Malcolm took a step back, pressing himself against the shadows of the hall, holding his breath. For a long moment she didn't move. Then she reached up, slow, deliberate, and pulled the veil back over her head. He felt something inside him sink. She knew he was there. She had let him see just enough. Malcolm turned away, walking back to his room in silence. The image of her unguarded form burned into his mind. He had wanted to see her. Now that he had, he wasn't sure what to do with it. Malcolm couldn't look at Zara the same way after that night. Every time they were in the same room, he felt the weight of a secret pressing down on him, an unspoken truth lodged in his throat. He had seen her, and she had known. And yet, she said nothing. She gave him no indication that anything had changed. But something had changed. He was more aware of her now, of the way she moved, of the way her voice carried when she spoke, of the way she sat by the window in the mornings, sunlight casting soft patterns over the veil that separated her from the rest of the world. He was aware of the way he wanted to see more, of the way that single glimpse had left him with a hunger he couldn't name, and he hated it, because it meant that she was winning, because it meant that he was losing. One evening, as they sat across from each other at dinner, he finally broke the silence. "I saw you," he said, voice low. Zara didn't even blink. "I know." Malcolm set his fork down, his fingers tightening against the edge of the table. "And you let me?" For the first time, her lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile, but something close. "Did I?" His jaw clenched. "You could have said something. You could have stopped you," she finished, tilting her head slightly. His pulse thrummed in his ears. "Yes." Zara exhaled softly, setting her own utensils aside. And would it have changed anything? He didn't know how to answer that, because the truth was, it had changed something. It had unraveled something inside him, something he couldn't put back together. Zara leaned forward slightly, resting her chin on her hand. "What did you see, Malcolm?" His throat tightened. He could lie. He could tell her she was ordinary, that the mystery had been broken, that he felt nothing. Now that he knew. But that would be the greatest lie he'd ever told. Because the truth was, he had seen something far more dangerous than beauty. He had seen a woman who refused to be defined by his gaze, and he didn't know what to do with that. Zara studied him for a long moment, then said, "You still don't understand, do you?" He exhaled sharply, frustration simmering beneath his skin. Then explain it to me. Her voice was soft but firm. Seeing someone and knowing them are not the same thing. The words settled between them, heavy and unshakable. Malcolm hated them, because for the first time in his life, he realized that he had never truly known anyone at all. Malcolm had spent his whole life believing that power came from control, from being the one who dictated the terms, who held all the cards. But now, standing in front of Zara, watching her with the same quiet confidence she had possessed from the beginning, he realized something he had never considered before. He had no power over her, not her thoughts, not her choices, not even the way she looked at him, as if she had already figured out the ending to a story he was still struggling to understand. And yet, she had all the power over him. That was why he had fought her so hard. That was why he had needed to see her face, why he had made it his mission to tear down the walls she had built. He had convinced himself that if he could just look at her, if he could strip away the mystery, then he would regain the upper hand. But now he saw the truth. She had never been hiding. He had. Zara stood by the window, the evening light casting a golden glow around her. He had never seen her veil as anything but a shield, a barrier keeping him out. But now, he wondered if it had been a test all along. "You're leaving, aren't you?" His voice was quieter than he intended. She didn't answer right away. She simply looked at him, the veil shifting slightly with her breath. "Do you want me to stay?" He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. The answer should have been easy. He should have said no, should have let her walk away and take whatever spell she had cast on him with her. But the words wouldn't come. Zara took a step toward him. "If I take this off now, will it make you love me?" His breath hitched, because he knew without a doubt that the answer was no. Not because she wasn't beautiful, not because he feared what lay beneath, but because he had already fallen in love with the woman behind the veil, without ever seeing her face, and that terrified him more than anything. For the first time, he was the vulnerable one. Zara nodded slightly as if she had heard the answer even though he had never spoken it aloud. She reached up, hands hovering at the edges of the veil. Malcolm held his breath. Then, just as she began to lift it, she stopped and smiled. Not with pity, not with amusement, but with something softer, something real. "Now you're ready," she murmured. Then, before he could say another word, before he could reach for her, before he could beg her to stay, she walked past him, leaving him standing there, his heart pounding, his world tilted on its axis. And for the first time in his life, Malcolm St. James knew what it meant to truly see someone. Malcolm didn't chase her, not because he didn't want to, not because every fiber of his being wasn't screaming at him to go after her, to stop her, to finally say the words he had been too proud, too blind to admit, but because he understood now. Zara had never belonged to him. She had never been something to uncover, to claim, to possess. She was her own person, whole and complete, whether he understood her or not, and he had spent so much time trying to break past her veil that he had failed to realize the truth. It had never been about her hiding from him. It had been about him hiding from himself. The house was quiet without her. It was as if her presence had filled the space between the walls, in the air he breathed, in the spaces between conversations, and now that she was gone, everything felt hollow. Days passed, then weeks. The whispers came and went. The world continued as if nothing had changed. But Malcolm had. He sat in his office one evening, staring at the whiskey in his hand. But for once, he wasn't drinking it. He was thinking. What did he really see that night? Not just her face, not just the shape of her features, the soft curve of her lips, the way her hair had fallen freely around her shoulders, but her, the woman who had walked into his life, who had never once begged for his love, never once sought his approval, never once let him dictate the terms of their marriage. And now, he was the one left behind, realizing too late that she had taught him something no one else had dared to. Love isn't about seeing someone, it's about understanding them. A knock sounded at the door. He didn't bother looking up. "What?" The butler cleared his throat. "Sir, a letter was delivered for you." Malcolm frowned, finally turning to see the small envelope placed carefully on the desk before him. There was no name on it, no return address, just a single wax seal pressed into the paper. His stomach tightened. He picked it up, breaking the seal with careful hands, unfolding the letter with slow precision. Inside, in neat flowing script, were 4 simple words. "Now you truly see." No signature, no explanation, but he didn't need one. A slow breath escaped him, something between a laugh and a sigh as he leaned back in his chair, staring at the words. For the first time in his life, Malcolm St. James had everything, and yet he had never wanted anything more than what he had already lost. He set the letter down, exhaling as he closed his eyes, because now he truly saw, and that was the only answer he would ever need.